Hi, everyone. Welcome to Globalization, Education, and Localization, how a little bit of language can go a long way at work. My name is Stephanie Horn, and I'm excited to be presenting today from my home in New York in the United States, which is actually nowhere near New York City. This is my second time at the gathering. I've wanted to go for years, but I've been a teacher and it's right around final exam time, so not a great time to travel. So I was able to attend virtually last year, and hopefully I'll be able to come in person someday. So the title is definitely a cute rhyme, but it's also the structure of the presentation. So let's break down what each part means. The first part is globalization. And we often use this word when talking about international companies and international influence. I went to business school to study accounting, and my professors would always talk about the world getting smaller, which means that, with the internet, the ability to travel, and disposable income, people can now access more parts of the world than they could even a few decades ago. With access to the world comes access to language, culture, and sometimes more job or business opportunities. So under this umbrella of globalization, I will talk about my experiences trying out languages with colleagues and clients who are from all over the world. Next is education. As I mentioned at the beginning, I used to be a teacher. I taught English to speakers of other languages for 7 years in the United States and in a few other countries. And the interesting thing about teaching your native language in your native country is that you often end up with students from all over the world with multiple languages spoken in the classroom, and many of which you don't even know yourself. So I'll explain how I navigated some of those multilingual challenges as a teacher in this education segment. And then we have localization. Localization is a term used for adapting products or services to different regions, and this often means translating into the local language or adjusting for cultural norms and expectations. I'm currently a project manager in the translation industry, and I very often work with languages that I can't read or write. So I'll explain how all of that works in localization. And then the final part of the title is how a little bit of language can go a long way at work. And so that's kind of trying to answer the question, how can I use basic language skills to benefit myself and others? And that keyword is basic, which I guess we could say is like A1 or A2 in the Common European Framework. So knowing a bit of vocabulary, being able to hold a small conversation, things like that. There's definitely lots of different schools of thought in the language learning community about what it really means to know a language or when knowledge can be considered useful. And I'm not trying to argue that being able to say sziasztok means that you're fluent in Hungarian, but I do think that any amount of knowledge can be useful in the right context. So in short, I'll be explaining how I've been able to use basic language skills to make a difference in different multicultural and multilingual workplaces, and how you might be able to as well. So let's talk first about this term imposter syndrome. It's probably something that many of us can relate to. So imposter syndrome is doubting your abilities or thinking you're not good enough or that you don't deserve your accomplishments. I see this all the time and experience it myself. People will write a grammatically perfect post and then end it with, sorry for my bad English, or they scored a C1 on a language exam and like, oh, it must have just been a lucky day because my Dutch is terrible, or oh, well, I speak 3 languages, but it's not that big of a deal because this person speaks 5. It's great to be humble and recognize that you have more to learn, but being too humble can actually be detrimental to your motivation and success. So what can we do to stop feeling like our skills are not good enough? It's really about your mindset. Start by setting small, realistic checkpoints along the way to your end goal and celebrate when you reach them. I studied abroad in Hungary many years ago, and my goal was to be able to have a conversation with my friends in Hungarian by the time I left. Some of my goals along the way included buying a bus ticket without anyone translating for me, or asking a stranger for directions and understanding their response. And each time I did something like that, I just had to remind myself, like, I couldn't do this yesterday, so it's awesome that I can do it today. and just, celebrating that little win. A lot of us also dream of being mistaken for native speakers, and it's really cool when you are. But I also think spending too much time comparing yourself to native speakers can be destructive to your self-esteem. Native speakers have had an entire lifetime of experience speaking your target language, so they have years more practice than you do. It's like starting piano lessons and thinking you're terrible because you don't play as well as Mozart or Beethoven. It's great to look up to these people and use them as role models for improving your skills, but just, be careful with how you let that affect your self-worth. As long as you're making progress, you're moving in the right direction. And finally, consider your purpose for learning and use that to measure your progress. So if you want to be conversational in Korean and you can make jokes, you can navigate the honorific system correctly, you can carry on conversations about various topics, but you can't understand a Korean research paper about organic chemistry, I think you can still call yourself conversational, because your goal was never to discuss scientific issues in an intense level. So it makes sense that you never focused on the terminology or background knowledge needed to do so. So using that to measure your abilities isn't fair to yourself. Hopefully the next time you find yourself dwelling on your mistakes or feeling bad about your language learning abilities, you'll remember some of these tips and keep going. Moving on to globalization. Just something that I wanted to point out. Last year, Alexander Majetovich did a great presentation called Do You Speak Business, about the way knowing languages could impact your career in different job sectors. And I'd really recommend checking that out if you are looking to market your languages for job opportunities. Since we're focusing more on basic skills here, I'll just talk a little bit about when I think you should or shouldn't try to communicate in a foreign language that you're just beginning to learn. So why you should try. One thing is that people care when they think that you care. So of course, there are cultural differences in how employers and employees treat each other and interact with each other in the workplace, depending on where you are. But I think most of us would agree that we like to feel valued and included. And when we feel valued and included, we take more pride in what we do, and that leads to better performance and productivity, which is great for everyone. So when you have employees or colleagues who speak another language, taking the time to learn about their language and culture sends a message that they're important to you and worth your time, and you get to establish just much more meaningful connections with them. My friend worked in a kitchen with mostly Spanish-speaking employees, and once she started using Spanish to talk with them, it really improved the mood in the kitchen and boosted morale, because everyone really appreciated their boss was going out of her way to communicate with them in their language. And a lot of bosses don't really take the time to do that. I worked in a school with a colleague from Nepal, and I had worked in previous jobs with Nepali students and was getting ready for a trip to Nepal. So I started, speaking a little bit of Nepali with him, and he was just really excited because no one else had really tried to do that before. And we ended up becoming friends, and we developed a bond that helped both of us, personally and professionally. So without that language as a common ground, we might not have thought to connect in that way. And we might not have been, as likely to establish a friendship. Language can also open the door to business and networking opportunities. I used to recruit international students at a local school, and I once traveled with a group of recruiters to visit schools in China. None of us spoke Mandarin very well, but some of us tried to speak what we knew and engage in small talk with the students and teachers. When it came time for students to pick the schools they liked, they almost always picked the schools with recruiters who tried to speak in their language, because we were the ones who showed that we cared about them beyond just the money they were going to give us. And we made the kids feel like we'd do our best to look out for them and make them feel safe and comfortable if they came to study with us. So that personal touch and connection can make a big difference in business. So language is just one of the ways you can do that, and you don't need to be fluent or very proficient to be able to, make a little difference. Those are just two ways that basic language skills can be helpful in the workplace. But of course, there are times when you should stick to your native language or the established language of business for your workplace. So when I say the established language of business, My current company, for example, has offices and business partners in many countries around the world, but we're supposed to do all official client communication in English. So that's our like established language of business. You should really be careful with anything beyond small talk. Any negotiations, technical discussions, topics that require expressing complex ideas, those should be done in a language you speak comfortably. It's really important that everyone's thoughts and questions are communicated accurately when business is at stake. So you should do that in a language that you feel really comfortable with, even if it requires the use of a translator or interpreter. The same with legal information or information that your colleagues might need access to later and they don't speak your target language. So that would be like contracts, instructions, policy updates. Any of those should be documented in the established language of business. And I do believe that any employees who don't speak or read the established language of business very proficiently should have access to this type of information in their home language, but that's not something that you as a beginner should be doing. You should be outsourcing that to someone who is fluent in the home language, like a professional translator or interpreter. Next, we'll move on to education. So just to show you how truly multilingual this experience has been, I've compiled a list of the languages and created a map of the birthplaces of the students I've worked with as an English as a new language or ENL teacher. And these are the ways that the students have identified their languages themselves. It's not meant to be political in any way. So to give you a bit of background, I've taught every grade from kindergarten, which in the US begins at age 4 or 5, or adult education classes with students as old as 75. Some were international students, meaning they came to the US for the purpose of studying. Some were immigrants whose families had chosen to move here for work or other opportunities. And most were refugees who were displaced from their homes for a variety of reasons and selected to relocate to my city. Even though the United States doesn't have an official language, most of the schools in the country have instruction in English. So when a student enrolls in school for the first time in New York State, they are asked which languages are spoken at home, and depending on the answer, they take a placement exam to determine their level of English and what language services they need. The students take another exam at the end of the school year to measure their progress and decide what services they need next year, and they keep taking this test every year until their score is high enough to be proficient. We do teach social English, but the primary goal is English for academic purposes because we want all of our students to graduate and have professional success, whether they go to college or go right into the workplace. It's probably a very different experience than some of you have had learning languages for fun. I also want to bring up some of the challenges my students have faced because I don't think that these apply to all language learners, but it's really like a good perspective to have. Some of my students have missed years of school or maybe never even went to school before due to circumstances like sickness or war. They might have never even learned to read or do math, which means even some teenagers that we start working with, we need to teach them the fundamentals of learning in addition to language skills. So many of our students struggle with adapting to American school culture, but the kids with interrupted and limited schooling have even more difficulties adjusting and progressing, which is not to say that they can't be successful, but they just have more challenges to overcome to catch up to other kids their age. Many of my students experience post-traumatic stress disorder based on situations that happened to them before coming to our school, and this can affect their concentration and ability to take in new information. Lack of technology skills or resources is a huge issue as well. Even before schools went remote because of the pandemic, in the US, most schools require students to carry around a computer and do all of their work online. But not all students are comfortable with technology or have access to it at home. I actually once worked with a 17-year-old who grew up in a refugee camp and didn't know what a computer was until his first day in our school. So we actually had to spend like a week teaching him how to sign on to a computer and use a password. And then we had to teach him how to use, Google Docs. I'm sure technology has been a great benefit to many of you while learning languages. So, just imagine how different the experience might have been without all the access to it. Age is also a factor, which is not to say that you can't learn a language after a certain age, but it does affect the services that people can receive. So in New York State, most American kids graduate high school by age 17 or 18, but you can go to public school until age 21. So anyone in public school who requires English services receives them for free. Once you graduate or turn 21, you're no longer eligible for free services. So depending on how old you are when you arrive in New York, you might need to learn English completely by yourself, or just do volunteer programs that sometimes don't have certified teachers. That's often easier said than done when you consider some of these other factors. And due to the limited services for adults, there's many situations where immigrant and refugee children speak English better than their parents. So parents often rely on their children to interpret and translate and take care of important matters for the family. Sometimes parents aren't able to help with homework or other important school issues because they aren't educated themselves, or just the American school environment is just so new to them that they don't know how to help. Sometimes children miss school or can't get their homework done because they're working or taking their parents to appointments. So very often these kids, a lot of my students said they always felt like the adults in the family, and it can lead to power struggles within the family, and it can often lead to less of an emphasis on school. And finally, while many of my students are polyglots, I worked with a few students who spoke 5 or 6 languages before learning English. Sometimes they feel that their skills are not valued because they don't speak maybe like a cool language or a popular language, which is unfortunately often tied to race or country of origin. And these students might struggle with motivation or confidence or making friends, and they might struggle more with that imposter syndrome, thinking that, they have all these skills, but it doesn't matter because they don't speak the right languages, or they might think that they're stupid because they haven't picked up English quickly. But, we all know that the ability to learn a language is not, based on just your intelligence. It's also based on your motivation, the degree of similarity with other languages, and a whole multitude of things. All of these perceptions could affect the ability to improve English or even motivation to come to school at all. I think that these are important to point out because many of us have the privilege of learning languages. So, we think it's fun, or we want to be able to watch like Japanese anime, or we want to make more money at work. And if you're at this conference, you have a large support system of fellow polyglots who can encourage you and help you practice. But in many cases, language learning is a necessity, and without that support system or access to the right tools or the right state of mind, it can be really challenging. So, I'm not asking you to feel guilty or to feel pity for anyone, but I would encourage you to find a way to use your skills to support learners who might not have the same opportunities. So some examples of why, even though I'm trying to teach English, why I might use my students' languages. The first is to build rapport, which is just a fancy way of saying connecting and learning to trust each other. So think of your first day at school or a new job or in a new city. It was probably a little scary if you didn't know anyone. So imagine being a young child and not knowing anyone and not understanding the culture and not understanding what anyone's saying to you. Even if people have big smiles on their faces and they're trying to be nice, it's still scary if you can't understand what anyone's saying. And depending on the circumstances that led you to this new place, you might already have a hard time trusting strangers and feeling safe. So there's actually a term in language learning called the affective filter. And if someone is stressed or nervous, all of those feelings act like a filter or a wall that prevent you from retaining new information. So when the person feels safe and comfortable, that filter is lowered and they can learn better. So a good tip for trying to speak a language is get yourself into an environment where you feel comfortable taking risks, and you'll probably perform much better. As a teacher, I always try to use students' languages as much as possible when I first meet them to help them feel welcome and to just let them know, like, I'm someone that cares and you can take risks around me. I'll never forget, I had a new student from Cuba who didn't speak any English, and I showed her around the school with my very elementary Spanish. So like, okay, esta la biblioteca, and esta el baño, and, tienes hermano? And, I don't speak Spanish very well. I actually studied Italian for a long time, so at some point, I think I actually started accidentally speaking Italian to her. But she was very grateful that I recognized she was scared and tried to make her feel better. And eventually, when she was ready to start speaking English, she felt comfortable trying that with me because she'd already seen me embarrass myself and step out of my comfort zone. So I set the tone for the class. Like, it's okay to make mistakes here. And, you know, as a teacher in general, I would encourage you to create that environment yourself. Anyone who's tried immersion in their target language knows that it's very exhausting. It can be really embarrassing, and how relieving and empowering it is when you actually understand what people are saying. So, you know, those little bits of the student's first language can be a big breath of fresh air at first. It's also helpful in meeting parents. So a lot of students' parents are nervous about coming to school because they don't speak English, and the American school system is so different from what they're used to. So we do use interpreters for conversations with parents, but speaking a few words and phrases of the home language yourself sets the tone of the visit that, you know, we care about you and welcome you and want to work with you. Another reason to learn your students' languages is it can actually help you be a better teacher in some ways, because understanding how another language works helps you understand the differences with your native language. So as an English teacher, understanding some of the fundamentals of different languages means, like, okay, I got a new student who is from an Arabic-speaking country. They'll, you know, definitely need to learn the Latin alphabet, and they'll need to learn how to write left to right instead of right to left. But they also might have trouble with b and p. And their writing, you know, they might need help with when to use a comma or when to stop a sentence. I found a lot of my Arabic speakers would have like really run-on sentences because of the way that the writing system is different in Arabic. Every student is different and will have unique challenges to learning a language. I've actually worked with twins and triplets who have had totally different needs. But understanding their language background can really help you figure out starting points for what to teach. And of course, your goal as an ENL teacher is ultimately to teach students English, but there are times when you need to communicate to students or families in their home language, and there's limits to what you should do yourself. I would go to a professional translator or interpreter for anything that's highly academic, any important legal or school information, like anything you'd send home to all the parents, that should be available in the parents' home language. And any serious mental or physical health concerns, like if you needed to go to a psychiatrist or a social worker. A1 or A2 language skills can make a huge difference in helping families acclimate and learn English, but it's not really enough to discuss very serious topics that could impact a child's future or health. And, you know, we try to treat everyone with dignity and respect regardless of their language background. So if I'm trying to have a serious discussion while talking to an adult with the vocabulary of a child, you know, that's maybe not the most respectful way to include them in the conversation. So how do we communicate when we can't communicate? Well, there's a lot of great professional services for schools and workplaces in the United States, at least. We have local translation agencies that will not only translate letters and school documents, but also state exams. The translators will sit with the student and read questions or even the whole test. We've also had a student write a whole essay in Ukrainian, and the translator translated it into English for us. So these things help us understand what the students actually know and not just what they're limited in expressing through English skills. New York also has bilingual glossaries, which I'll show in a minute. These are for major school subjects and in a ton of different languages, and students can use them for reference when working with academic vocabulary. And we also have an over-the-phone interpreting service, which when you call the number, you punch in a code, I think it's like 23 for Arabic, and they get an interpreter on the phone who can help you make phone calls. They can also be, you know, if you're in a meeting and an interpreter's not present, you could put the phone on speakerphone and have that interpreter interpret the conversation. Some strategies that I use as a teacher, I think the best way to help students is to just meet them at their level. There's a language learning theory called I+1, which means that the best way to improve your language skills is to expose yourself to content that's just a little more difficult than your current level. If it's too easy, you won't progress. And if it's way too hard, you won't progress either, because you might burn out. So expecting students that, came with a very low English proficiency score, expecting them to read and understand a history textbook on their first day of school probably isn't very fair, and will probably kill their self-esteem. But maybe they can read a picture book about a historical event and answer questions about it. Start there, gradually add more. Some examples of specific supports are like simplified text, which maybe some of you use in your target language, and sentence frames to help with writing. So in these cases, here are some sentence frames that I might help a student with for an essay or a debate. So all they really have to focus on at first is putting in like the meat of the content. And then they kind of see these examples and learn the structure of the sentences that we would expect them to write. And here are some bilingual glossaries. So here's English language arts in Albanian, math glossary for grades 3 through 5 in Tibetan, and Slovak earth science. And here's physics for TWE. And while we're on the topic of translation, we can move on to localization. Here's another fun list. All the languages I've worked with since starting work as a project manager in the translation industry. As you can see, there's a lot of languages. And just to clarify, translation is reading and writing, and interpretation is speaking and listening. So I wish I could read and write all of these languages, but I do not. So people ask a lot, do I need to know a bunch of languages to work in the translation industry? And I've been kind of surprised to find out that really the only ones that require fluency or proficiency in multiple languages are translator and interpreter. And you would typically translate or interpret into your native language because, and I guess that depends on need, but you might be fluent in a bunch of languages, but you'll typically better understand the cultural or linguistic nuances that make the word sound natural in your native language. And then we also really look for people who have industry experience. So if I'm translating a medical document, I'd hire a linguist who has medical experience over a linguist with business experience. Same for legal documents or engineering documents, anything with technical knowledge. So if you want to be a translator, it really helps to study and work in other fields besides just studying linguistics. My friend is an American Sign Language interpreter, and she had to interpret for a biochemistry exam. And I just, she had to learn a whole bunch of biochemistry to be able to help, because she's like, this is not my field at all. So obviously that industry knowledge makes a big difference depending on what you're translating or interpreting. And with any job, we also look for communication and ability to meet deadlines. So if you produce great work, but you're rude and you don't turn your work in or on time, people won't want to hire you. And then, here are a few jobs in the translation industry that don't always require knowing a bunch of languages outside of your company's official language of business. This was really surprising to me when I started, how many jobs there are where other skills are kind of maybe more important. So for example, my company's language of business is English. I need to know English for my job so I can communicate with clients and service providers. But if I'm managing a translation project in Turkish and Swahili, I don't need to understand those languages to do my job. So examples, a project manager, that's what I do. When we receive a project, I kind of hire the linguist to do the job and anyone to do special services, and I deliver it and do quality checks. Graphic designers and media specialists are the ones that actually put the translations into posters and videos and make sure it looks good. Localization engineers are programmers, so they get the translations into apps and websites. And recruiters are people who find people to work for the company in different departments and negotiate their pay. So in many of these jobs, you'll be surrounded by languages, but you don't have to know them all fluently. Instead, you'll have to know things like programming or working in InDesign or building relationships and communicating effectively. So these are great jobs to look into if you like languages, but you're maybe not you don't have the skills to be a translator or interpreter, or that doesn't really interest you. There's lots of other things that you can do and still work with languages. Yeah, so I don't always know the languages. I don't always speak or read the languages needed within the project. So a lot of responsibility does fall on our translators and interpreters to make sure the project is completed with the best quality. But there are some translation tools that even, I can use for quality checks. So one is the translation memory, or the TM. When we put a document into translation software, the text is divided up into segments like sentences or phrases. And when the project is finished, the segment is saved in the translation memory for future use. So the next time that segment appears in another project, it will show you similar segments that were already translated, which helps with consistency. So here, this is a software called MemoQ. You see the next stop is Tower Bridge, and that's 70% similar to a previous translation. The next stop is Charing Cross. So that 70% is the similarity to previous translations, and it also tells you what's different between the translations. So here, the only difference is that one is Charing Cross, one is Tower Bridge, and we won't be translating those names anyway. So we can use that same construction to next to Haltestelle ist, and then you would just put in Tower Bridge. Another thing that helps is the term base. So this is a glossary that the client provides to us that tells us their preferred translation for certain words and phrases, and it's programmed into the software. So anytime the word or phrase appears in the text, the linguist knows to use that. In this case, it's a program called MemSource, and these yellow words means that there's something in the term base for them, and red means that you should not ever use that translation. So my Russian is not great, but I know that download should be translated as skachat. So if a different word is used, I know that the linguist didn't follow the term base. And I know here, MemSource should not ever be spelled with a capital S. So that helps with consistency as well. And we also have what's called a quality assurance, or QA check, which are automated checks for translation errors, or, it basically looks into the translations, analyzes them against rules or resources that we programmed in, and it helps us look for inconsistencies. So here, this is from Madcap Lingo. There's 3 different translations of Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall that are all just a little bit different. So what I would do if I looked at this QA report, I would ask the linguist to review them and just make sure that those are supposed to be intentionally different. And if not, then they should fix them to make them more standard. So it's not necessary to know the languages your team is translating, but there are a few ways it can be helpful. So one would be like catching small mistakes like typos, or if there's issues with formatting, maybe a word is supposed to be bolded in the English file, but the formatting didn't transfer over to the target file. If you know those words, you can kind of find that. It's also helpful if you know right to left languages like Hebrew and Arabic. Sometimes when you copy and paste into certain file formats, the orientation is not preserved, so the text comes out backwards. But if you don't know those languages, you might not realize that, and you might send something to the client that's completely useless. So that's always very helpful. And we do use English for official communication, but any opportunity to use a little bit of language with your partners during small talk is always appreciated. Very helpful for phone calls too. A lot of our clients and service providers have operators who only speak the local language. So if you call and you try to speak English, I've been hung up on before. One time I reached an answering machine in French, and I left an awkward message because I don't speak French, and I didn't realize that the answering machine said that they were closed for the next 3 days. And I only figured that out after another colleague called them with a question. And, a little bit of French might have been helpful there. We can also sometimes use our knowledge in QA reports. Even just knowing a little bit about grammar can be helpful. So here's some examples of text that might show up in the term base. So in the case of Polish, there's only one word that we use for operating system that's translated in. And so there's all these different declensions where the computer just reads the rule, operating system always has to be translated this way, and flags all of these as errors. But depending on the context, these are correct. Same with Latvian. It's the term base only says translate patience as this. And if this comes up, then it will say an error. So we know that's a false positive. Unfortunately, computers can't critically think the way that we can. And so this happens a lot. The same with Portuguese. In these two cases, there are two different versions of the word good, and it's flagged for inconsistency, but they're actually correct because there are gender differences in the words they're referring to. One is male and one is female, so they actually should not be the same word. And the same in German. In this case, DD is flagged as a potential typo because the same word shows up twice. But in this case, D is a relative pronoun for die Frau, the woman, and it can also be an article for the milk, die Milch. So that's actually correct, but a computer just knows the rule to, make sure that the same word isn't repeated. This happens in some other languages as well. Yeah, so these are examples of times when you might be able to use your basic language skills on a translation project, but of course, you need to be very careful. Anything that's highly specialized, something you're not 100% sure about, you should always leave to a professional linguist. People pay a lot of money for translation, and we have certain international standards we have to meet for quality. And that means that, I shouldn't be translating things myself if I'm not a certified linguist. And, just anything that's more than small talk and related to business should be done in your company's established language of business. So I've mentioned using professionals quite a few times, and the focus has, of course, been on beginner skills. But some of you might be interested in becoming one of these language professionals yourself. And I'm not a hiring manager or expert, but I just wanted to, maybe flesh out some of the ideas that I've already talked about. I mentioned over the phone interpreting earlier, which I used a lot as a teacher for communicating with families. And if you don't have a lot of opportunities for interpreting in your immediate area, but you're highly proficient in speaking 2 or more languages, I'd look into something like this. Just know that interpreting is not just knowing the languages, but there's also skills such as, being able to think in both languages at the same time and being able to, give timely feedback. I would definitely, suggest training for this, but that's something you could look into. The same with translation. Translators Without Borders is an awesome humanitarian organization that strives to provide access of information to everyone, regardless of their language background. I am not affiliated with them, but I follow a lot of what they do on social media, and I know they're a nonprofit organization, and they're always looking for volunteers who read and write multiple languages, especially languages without a lot of mainstream representation. So like, for example, a lot of things are translated into French for Africa, but there's so many languages in Africa and so many people that don't speak French well. And if you just rely on French to spread information, that's not really equitable for everybody. And then industry knowledge, of course, is very important to make sure you understand the content and terminology of the text. And depending on the job you want, you might want to consider getting certifications or putting together a portfolio of translations for review, which is not necessary for every job, but definitely, something nice to have on hand. And yeah, here is an example of the COVID-19 glossary put together by Translators Without Borders to make sure that accurate information was being spread to communities around the world, regardless of language. They don't just do healthcare, they do a ton of different industries, but this is something I know they worked on very hard last year. So just to sum up, beginner level skills do have a place at work for connecting with people, being inclusive, improving your teaching, and maybe even saving you some time. But there are limitations, especially anything that's technical, legal, or sensitive discussions. And to stay motivated and measure your progress, think about your end goal and set mini checkpoints to reach along the way. I did see there was a question about a small win, and I guess that can kind of be whatever you want it to be. It depends on your goal. Everyone's goals are kind of highly individualized. So yeah, just think about like what are some steps to progress to your goal. And it's good to be realistic about the work that still needs to be done, but don't let that keep you from remembering the value of what you've already put in. And I've already said this like 4 times, but in order to get your language skills to a place where you can use them professionally, you'll likely need technical and linguistic experience in the field or industry you want to work in, whether that's medicine, law, business, or something else. I'm so happy to see some questions on here. Have you ever encountered situations where your attempts to engage in someone's native language were not appreciated or even rejected? Yeah, I think that there are a lot of people that they feel like, you know, English only, English is the most important thing. I don't want to, you know, they really want to challenge themselves, and they might not appreciate some of the bilingual resources we provide for them. That's sort of their, you know, I actually suggest using your languages that you already know to help you learn another language, especially for academic purposes. But that's sort of, I guess, up to the individual themselves. Also, yeah, I mean, I don't speak a lot of languages very well. And so if I didn't know the language, sometimes it is just easier to communicate in a language that either having an interpreter or translator with me, you know, that gets things done a little bit faster than, like I said, trying to speak with my elementary skills. Yeah, sometimes that, like I said, doesn't really go very far, and it's better to just sort of cut our losses there and, you know, get down to business. I hope that answers your question. How can I get in contact with people that don't speak English and can't afford a school or a private teacher? That is also a great question. So I can only speak to the places that I've lived and worked, but there are a lot of volunteer agencies that help refugees when they come to your country, that help them, you know, get clothes, get acclimated. There's a lot of legal paperwork that needs to be done. And so there's often some sort of volunteer agency that has connections like this. My city is called a sanctuary city, which means that we accept anybody who comes in regardless of their background. So we have a ton of those agencies. I would look maybe for refugee organizations, and they're usually looking for volunteers. And sometimes it's not just like teaching English. They might also need help with bringing food to families or donating clothes. So yeah, I would look to see if there are any organizations like that in your hometown. How can we best adjust to and help refugees who have symptoms or are diagnosed with PTSD? Yeah, that is really challenging. And I would say that involving mental health experts. So like at my school, we had social workers, we had school psychologists, we had, you know, just the regular student counselors that are more trained in those types of emotional needs, and having an interpreter or translator available to accurately discuss that information would be very helpful. Yeah, definitely involving mental health professionals. And I think just as a teacher or as someone at the workplace, I know that a lot of refugees, you know, get help with job placement. This can really affect their ability to learn or their ability to do work. And so just being patient and understanding that, you know, they might not be ready to do an exam in earth science. Sometimes, you know, you need to take care of those mental health needs first. And so just being aware of that, getting them support with mental health professionals, and then kind of, like I said, take things as they go, and meeting them where they are. I know that sometimes teachers, you know, they have their one way of teaching and they want to they expect every kid to fit into that. And that's sort of something that's changing in American schools is, you know, instead of teaching with the style that you're comfortable with, you might need to make adjustments for kids, and just having that flexibility and that empathy is really important. And also just, you know, I think sometimes we pity refugees, and I don't think that they need pity. I think they need just like a friend who's there to help them. So yeah, being there for all of those needs is helpful as well. Do you have any advice on working with refugees that don't speak any English at all? For example, in emergency scenarios or outside of the classroom? If you have access to an over-the-phone interpreting service, that is probably the most helpful. I know that that's not always available. So in that case, I guess body language and images and visuals, like those can go a long way. For example, I'm thinking about like an emergency situation, like a medical situation, you know, you can kind of point to your head, you can, you know, things like that. And it's awkward. But any type of communication, if something, yeah, I think people, it might take a long time and it might feel a little uncomfortable, but using things like that can be really helpful. I wouldn't always recommend that people use their family members to translate, just because you don't always know if they're telling all the right information. And I don't mean that in a way that like they're trying to hide anything from you, but a professional interpreter is definitely more you know, unbiased in what they're saying. But if there is a family member around that speaks the language, that can be very helpful in those cases. And what can I consider a small win? I kind of already mentioned that, but yeah, I would say that that's kind of up to you and what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to be conversational, then like I said, with Hungarian, I think that, you know, being able to buy a bus ticket by myself is a big win. And that's something on the way to eventually being conversational. So kind of think of your end goal and what are some, yeah, I guess a small win can be anything that you couldn't do before that you can do now. That's a win. Do you think all project manager translation roles would allow a language lover to deal with the actual language, or would most of the work be planning, emailing, and reporting? So this is actually very different depending on the company that you work for and the company structure. So I know there's definitely a lot of planning, emailing, and reporting because your goal is to get the project done. And that often requires a lot of you know, communicating between different people. But I also know that some companies have like language experts, so they deal more with the linguist side of things. So I, as a project manager in my current role, I deal with both the clients and the linguists. And so the clients, that's very much the like overhead account things. And then the language experts side, like I work with the linguists, make sure that they understand the needs of the project. And yeah, I know that in some countries or in some companies, they might have, you know, only people that know Spanish or working on Spanish translations. It kind of depends on the, I guess, the breakdown of your company, if that helps. But you will be doing a lot of emailing and reporting, I'm sure. Yeah, so I think those are all the questions. Thank you so much. And if there's anything else, I left my email address in my profile. I didn't really fill out a lot of the other stuff, but definitely included my email address. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time. And yeah, thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.